All right, what's up, world? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And today I'm very happy to be joined by one, for me, a new colleague of mine. I've been happily tossed into her department at Morgan State University. And I'm talking, of course, about Dr. Sara Rahnama, who, among many other things, is the associate professor and director of the program for the study of the Middle East and North Africa in the History and Geography Department in Morgan State University. And we're going to be talking today about her relatively new book, new to me at least. The Future is Feminist: Women and Social Change in Interwar Algeria, on Cornell University Press 2023. Professor Rahnama, greetings. It's a pleasure to meet you and have to host this discussion.
Hi, thank you so much. This is fun. I'm excited.
So I do want to say, and I hope you don't mind, but every once in a while, uh, well, the joke I was thinking was every once in a while, my rank at Morgan is acknowledged, and I get put on a certain committee. And in this case, it was an honor and a privilege to be on part of your tenure and promotion committee, and where I got to actually see some of the work that you and other of our colleagues get to do, which is not always the case. We don't always know what each other are doing. And I just want to shout you out and praise that you have been. I mean, it was one of the more impressive um, applications, and I was very eager to learn more about your work and to get to meet you. And so this is great. So congratulations on everything. And yeah, just wanted to shout you out for that real
Dude,
quick.
thank you. Yeah, it was funny when I got your email and I read that you had been on the committee. I was like, oh, he knows my work like for real.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I mean the process of tenure forces you to just dig out any little thing you could possibly be proud of. And so yeah, it was just
Yeah, and it was fun because again, admittedly I don't get to engage as much as I'd like with my colleagues, and in this case with our committee, I was very proud of our efforts because everybody took it very seriously. We dug into all the applications, had some vigorous discussions, which is what I've always thought was part of the excitement of the job. I always liked that kind of.
Mhm.
And I remembered that yours was particularly impressive. I mean, so and then I do like to add that for those who are not always aware that at an HBCU where there is an emphasis on teaching and relative struggles with resources, that you're able to produce this level of scholarship. I think it's just an additional and in terms in addition in all the other work that you're involved in and have done and are doing. I just think it's just an additional level of kudos is warranted. So
Thank
you
you.
know
Thank
just
you.
wanted to shout you out. And I like to, sometimes our audience doesn't always get to see that side of the academic
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
and so I just appreciate that, and so salute, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know if there'll be a space to talk about it later in the podcast, but I feel really blessed to be at HBCU. I am so happy with my job and especially with the different kind of circumstances that we've seen unfolding in academia in the past couple of years. It's to the point that if I ever moved jobs, I feel like it would need to be at HBCU again. Like I'm just like committed to being in this world because I see how different it is from the rest. And I feel really blessed and fortunate to be able
Well,
to.
let me just say I appreciate that because the my relative, the audience for this show will know that I've shared a number of my own struggles, and so I appreciate being reminded of that perspective.
Yeah.
And in general I agree, because again, once the door closes, for me at least, in the classroom and engaging with the students, that's the best part. Some of the others has been a little bit of a but like I said, I'm glad to be reminded of that perspective, and I hope it and I hope it maintains, because I think that's ultimately the goal, to have a situation where people want to be there and be comfortable and are supported. And as you said in your acknowledgments, which I did note in your book, the department and Morgan have provided that for you. So that's great, and that's how it should be. So again, by the way, I also, speaking of which, I noted that you shouted out someone I have a tremendous amount of respect for in those acknowledgments, Dr. Nathan Connolly at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
So he's had a big influence on me and my little bit of work, and a really good dude. So uh,
Such a good dude,
yeah.
such a good dude. Yeah, I was really lucky at I mean, what's interesting is that the department at Hopkins where I did my PhD has changed tremendously since the time that I was there. Now, like,
Mm,
I left, about 8 years ago. At the time that I was there, there was it was a much whiter department. I'll just say that.
mhm,
It was a much whiter department. And
mhm,
so I kind of struggled to find, and to the extent that now folks who are there now, like Martha Jones, Jessica Marie Johnson, who came in right as I was leaving, I've like still maintained a lot of connections to Hopkins. At Morgan, we're just down the street, but
mhm,
often it doesn't happen, because of the way we're in our kind of silos. But I've maintained those connections because I seriously feel like it's like healing for me. It's like
mhm,
healing this thing that wasn't there in my graduate school education that I wanted so badly. But Nathan Connolly was my like refuge in that space. And actually, I mean, he worked on the history of the United States, and I was doing this project about colonial Algeria. And so on paper it was like, why would you two ever work together? And I kind of pitched this idea to him of what if I did a field that we called comparative racial regimes. And so it was thinking about Jim Crow and colonialism as kind of like twin racial regimes in a world that I cannot understate how profoundly this field impacted me. And then fast forward to being on the job market and the position at Morgan, they were looking both for somebody who could do kind of Middle Eastern history, but also be able to teach history of the African diaspora, which is a really central important course in our department and in our institution. And I felt like I could teach that course because of this work that I had done with Nathan Connolly, but also just also in my own research. There's a chapter of my book where I'm thinking about women domestic workers moving, working in European French homes and moving through the city, and there were all sorts of ways that Jim Crow dynamics, apartheid dynamics, like all of these other things I had read about with him were influencing the way I was thinking about it, in the kind of French colonial aspect, and I just to this day, even in the way I teach, I'm really committed to helping my students make those connections between dynamics that they might be familiar with in an American context and helping them see how those play out abroad as well. Because it's just so silly, how sometimes in our disciplines, we just think of it as like they do that kind of history, these do this kind of history, as if there's no, relationship between them. And so, yeah, I'm so incredibly grateful to have been able to work with him and have been able to, I really feel like, craft a view of history which is more transnational and how it should be, but unfortunately is often not how it is.
right on. Yeah. Um, so as we sort of start to turn towards your book here, I did want to start by inviting you to just talk a little bit about broadly about the book and your intent here. But I did want to start with this question that I had, as I think I put in the email to you initially, that in a study group I was in recently, we had been reading the book African Women in Revolution, and what emerged to me as it's a collection of various essays, now I think at least 20 years old, that tracks different parts of the African continent and various struggles in the post-colonial period. And it occurred to me that there was this theme in each instance of women being invited and playing an equal role when it came to pushing for revolution and decolonization, and then fighting against the colonial powers in every form, from armed to every other form. And then once the colonial power was removed, those women seemed always to be replaced and returned to their pre-existing, whether you want to blame it, as your book somewhat talks about it, or does talk about, blame it on the colonial condition
Mhm.
or any traditional pre-colonial practices, women would then return to some subservient
Mm.
status.
Mm.
So I just wanted to ask you broadly, if because I did, how does that fit with what your research shows?
Mhm.
And then I did also want to ask you about what is Algeria today, because your book
Mhm.
does sort of conclude or involve some discussion of uh, today. So I just, yeah, but but however you want to respond to any of that, please use that to tell us a little bit about broadly about your book and what your intent here has been.
Sure, sure. Maybe I'll start by answering the question and
Sure,
then talk about the book
cool,
broadly.
thanks.
So the book is really looking at this earlier period, 1920s, 1930s. So kind of the generation that comes before the women who directly participated in the battle. I was about to say the Battle of Algiers, but the War of Independence. Um, Algeria is a little bit of a unique, in some ways, it's a unique situation because actually, after the War of Independence, Algeria has a very unique kind of legal code that happens in post-independence Algeria, which is very, grants women a lot of rights, more rights than other kind of spaces in the region, and it's kind of thought that that exists as a kind of thank you almost to women for their role in the War of Independence, in the struggle for independence. Now, parts of that are kind of taken back in the decades that follow, so it's not a kind of permanent solution. But one of the dynamics that happened, which I think, reveals a little bit why what you're describing happens, is that, in the build up to the war, as women start kind of organizing and creating their own women's groups and things like that, they're continually told. I talk about this at the very end of the book. They're continually, in the conclusion, they're continually told, let's work on this issue of, anti-colonialism, of an independent Algeria first, and once we solve that problem, then we'll come to these questions about gender. And so even though, they were organizing themselves, the kind of goal of independence was always forced to be at the forefront, and other gender issues were kind of pushed back. And so I feel like, that shaped what followed in a way, because it was, the issues were never allowed to be central. And so even in a post-independence Algeria, it's kind of, it's not, a major priority of the state or of, Algerian society to resolve these kinds of gender issues, because everything was understood as being subsumed under this kind of colonial question. But there is a kind of active feminist movement that kind of grows also in the years following independence. And I mean, one thing I'm reminded of is last November, a year ago now, I had the opportunity to go to Algeria, go back and share, the book now that it had been out. And it was funny, because I chose the topic of the book, The Future is Feminist, as a way, as kind of a provocative title. And I was like in denial about what it means to publish an academic book where you have like 5 people reading it. I was like, no, I'm going to speak to everybody, and I'm going to, write this book that anybody could pick up and read, and blah, blah, blah. I had this kind of naive aspiration. But what was funny was when I got to Algeria, the conversations were so quickly derailed about the book because of the title and the language of feminism. And it forced me to reckon with, I think, the really violent legacy of feminism in that part of the world. And specifically how, for Algerian women, feminism still is understood as this kind of Western superiority, over, brown women being told like you're oppressed because of your culture, because of your religion, and you don't have full equality with men, and that's why you're backwards, and that's why you're ineligible to be considered modern citizens, and all of this kind of patronizing stuff that I feel like, in my, granted, I mean, that's not to say we don't have a white feminism problem in America too. We do, obviously we do. I think like it's, morphed into kind of girl boss feminism, where the height of feminist activity is like getting a CEO position, never mind, who you had to trample on to get it, or never mind the status of the women at the bottom of the company, or any of that. I think the movement of feminism in some, has been co-opted into this very convenient understanding of what feminism could mean. It's not disruptive to the power structures that be. But it, there are still enough kind of like third world feminisms and things like that in my ecosystem that I don't know, I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting the extent to which women were really uncomfortable with that language of feminism, and understood my position as an American woman of Iranian descent, but not Algerian. For them, I was a total outsider. It didn't matter that I was a Muslim woman. They were like, who are you as an American to come and tell us that we need feminism?
Mm.
And it was so funny because I was like, well, that's not what the book is saying. Like, the book is not saying you guys have a feminism problem and here, let me teach feminism to you. But because that was so often the kind of framing around feminism for them, that was the lens that they immediately went to. And I had to kind of explain, like, no, actually, this book is kind of uncovering a longer feminist history within Algerian society, and not from a place of like lack or, whatever, but just to say like this exists, So it's been really interesting and complicated, and nuanced. And it's funny how, I mean, you can work, this book for me was a project of 10 years, and still there's new things that are revealing themselves to you as now the book is out and I'm presenting on it to a different audience. Before I leave this topic, there was one really funny moment where this woman was like, people think that Algerian women are oppressed, but we're not. We're like the deep state. We hold the power, but it's not always immediately visible.
Okay. We're talking. I mean, it did make me. I was just quickly. I went back and was looking at the cover,
Yes, yeah.
and I'm just wondering, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, if I could see
Yeah.
if you've never first of all, if you haven't read the book
Yeah.
and you see the cover with the future is feminist at the top like that, and then you see the juxtaposition, as I'm assuming was the intent,
Yeah.
of the various forms of influence and stress literally looking at each other.
Right.
Somebody could walk away if and say, "What is she trying to do here?"
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny though. That's so, and you're saying it again. It was primarily Algerian women who were having this response.
Yeah, and they were, and old, I would say actually older women, and they were
Mm.
younger women who were thanking me because they were like, this is a legacy, a feminist legacy that we don't hear about, and we don't talk, there isn't, there aren't works that are dealing with this. And so they were really, relieved. And it was interesting. I would have, men in the audience who'd be saying, we don't have a feminism problem here. And then other young women who would speak up and be like, yes, we do. And here's what's going on in my, in my hometown. And these are some of the dynamics at play, and blah, 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 blah. So it's interesting, the different, there's definitely a generational story as well. I can imagine how some of those older women have come into contact with this kind of patronizing maternalist feminism enough in their life that they're really, jaded. But also, I mean, I'll say, like, I'm sitting in these university classrooms and they're full of women. I mean, I feel like that in and of itself is a huge thing that is definitely not the dominant American understanding of being in a Muslim country. I mean, when this past summer, Israel was bombing Iran, we had like someone on The View saying like women are not educated in Iran. They're not allowed to be educated in Iran. Mind you, like that's so false. It's like 60, I think it's like 60% of Iranian college students are women. Like it was like completely fabricated. I still don't understand how The View is like allowed to be a show. Like,
Yeah,
let's
I was
just
gonna say, I was,
let
imagine
these
The View not understanding something about Iran, like
let's just
imagine.
let these uninformed women
Yeah,
opine on like global politics. That's a good idea. Like, it's just so
very
weird.
helpful, very
But
helpful.
anyways, like that's the dominant understanding is like, oh, in a Muslim country, women are not educated, women can't do this, they can, and so I'm sitting in these rooms full of smart women who have, who are educated, women who are, professors, who have all these different social positions. And so I also think, does Algeria today have problems that women would like to resolve? Absolutely. And yet on the other hand, you know women are doing a lot there. We don't need to shed a tear for Algerian women, either. They're not like, our fantasy of the oppressed Muslim women is not what life looks like there for Algerian women. So,
Right. Okay. So having maybe dispelled a little bit of the confusion at the title and maybe the cover, and not having read the book, when people actually do read the book, what are you intending to say both about feminism and Algeria, and beyond? Yeah.
So basically, the book begin this kind of starting point of the book is work that I was able to kind of start here because other scholars and historians have done this, like other aspects of this work, and one piece of that is showing how from the very beginning of the French colonial project in Algeria, the exclusion of Algerians and Muslims from French citizenship was done with reference through ideas about gender and sexuality. So you would have the creation of like a legal code in which Algerians have secondary status in their own land, and French and European have primary French citizenship, kind of more primary status. And when politicians are explaining why Muslims cannot have French citizenship, they're bringing up things like polygamy, and they're saying, French. They're saying the way Muslims are with respect to gender and sexuality is just so different from us that they couldn't possibly be considered eligible for citizenship. And these are ideas that morph, but still persist in France today. Ideas that like Islam is particularly misogynistic. We see that in women veiling, and therefore this religiosity is some kind of affront to modern citizenship. That there's a tension there. So this is a very persistent, unfortunately, idea, but a very old one. And I bring it to the forefront because I think that helps us see the conversations that my book is bringing up in new light, basically. So my book then explores the conversations that are happening about women, mostly in the press, but in public life in interwar Algeria broadly. So in theater performances, on the pages of the press, in the cinema, in sermons happening in mosques. Everybody is kind of abuzz with questions of women's rights and how Algeria, education for women could be a path for Muslim society in Algeria to kind of advance itself, even in spite of how kind of colonialism brings all these constraints. So there's kind of two sides to the book. One side is this kind of discursive side, looking at these discussions that are happening about women, but there's also the other side is like actually looking at real women's lives. And so I talk about how in this period in the 1920s, you have massive rural to urban migration. So people come from all of these rural areas into Algerian cities. And in rural environments, it was always the norm for women to work. They would be, doing various things that were, contributing to the family's economic life. And And so when they move into the city, of course, they're going to work too. And so they start working as domestic workers, as servants in European homes. And I talk about what a drastic shift that was in the urban landscape, where now in the mornings you have like thousands of women leaving Muslim neighborhoods, going into European neighborhoods to work, women earning income. So that changes like the family dynamics within the household because she's the one earning a regular paycheck. And it produces this kind of, panic in the press too, of like, it's women are going to work and wearing makeup, and, what's going on in our society? Are we like losing the moral fabric of our society? Those kinds of predictable panics unfold as well. And so I argue that's something that makes Algeria also really unique with compared to other places. In other places, when you talk about the beginning of a feminist movement or a women's rights movement, it's usually elite educated women who are at the forefront of those movements. But in Algeria, the time period I'm writing about, 1930, this is 100 years into the French colonial project in Algeria. So Algeria had been under the constraints of this settler colonial system for so long that you don't have that same class of educated women, elite women. So it's working class women who are prompting some of these discussions in the press and prompting this kind of panic and this, larger conversation about women's education and women's advancement and all of these other kind of dynamics. And I argue that one of the reasons these discussions are so important is because of that very fact that I started with, that ideas about gender were central to the French legal exclusion of Muslims. So when Muslims or Algerians are writing in the press and they're saying, we believe in women's rights, and this is not something we're learning from France, this is something that we're learning from our own faith, and here are all the examples of the way that Islam is emancipatory for women. When they say that, they're writing back against the very foundations of the whole colonial enterprise. They're saying, all of these claims that we're inferior because we subjugate women, like, not only do they have no basis, but they're like actually the opposite of the truth. So there's a really interesting kind of ideological world making thing that's happening too, where they're kind of reordering the world and saying, we refuse to buy into this story that the French are selling about our inferiority.
Right on. Yeah, I was. You mentioned it. I was drawn to something that you talk about in the introduction to the book of that your book is not another story of women's silences and absences. The study is unlike those on the women's rights projects that swept the Middle East in the interwar years. Begins with working class women, uh, who you also describe as in quoting. Actually, I'm not entirely sure who you're quoting, but you as illiterate but hyper politicized.
Oh yeah, this was a woman who participated in the Algerian War of Independence, who
Right.
like took up arms, and that's how she described her mother. She said, "My
Mhm.
mother was illiterate but hyper politicized," and so that's one of the questions that animated me, is like, who are the women who raised these girls? And the women and men, because I read a lot of the writers I write about are men, but who is the generation that raised these girls who later were willing to take up arms and bombs and, play these really active roles in the French struggle for liberation? Because the history books really didn't talk about what came before. And I felt like there has to be a prehistory. You can't say that women were just completely oppressed, no role in society, and then suddenly, I joke, like kicked down the door and had a gun and we're like, "Pa, pa, 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 pa," for the, for the cause. Like it doesn't make sense. And so I was kind of curious, like what came before, and those were some of the questions that were animating me at the beginning of this research project.
Right on. By the way, I didn't think to ask till you were talking earlier. What drew you to this subject?
Yeah.
Given as was pointed out, you're not Algerian, and from the United States, at least here in the United States. What drew you to this time period in this region?
So it was kind of a mix of things. When I was an undergraduate, I wanted to learn French. And so I decided to study abroad in France to kind of improve my French. And I these kind of colonial dynamics, basically, or dynamics that are Islamophobic dynamics that are a remnant of colonialism, are so alive in France today. And I would say, like, as a Muslim woman who wears hijab, it was a very embodied experience being there and being confronted with all of this stuff. So that was probably the first thing that kind of piqued my interest in this. And when I was doing a master's before I started my PhD, I was interested in, very just kind of randomly, I ended up writing about this one magazine in France that was started by Paulette Nardal and her sister. So it was like this moment of Black internationalism in France. And this moment, it was, again, a kind of intersection between feminism and anti-racism, being pushed by women from the Black Caribbean. But in Paris. And when I started my PhD program, I was kind of sick of how I felt like there was so much scholarship about Paris and London and New York and these Western cities as these sites where colonial people came together. And there's reasons for that. I mean, that all of that scholarship is great, important work. But I felt like there was this kind of implicit implication that the rest of the world was this dead space intellectually. And so I was like, no, I want to know what's happening in Algiers, what's happening in Dakar. And so I had envisioned that I was going to do this kind of comparative project, and I wasn't sure what the contours were going to be. I just knew I was interested in intellectual life in those spaces. And so I started ordering newspapers that were from Algeria in that period on microfilm that were in French. At the time, my Arabic was not strong at all. And so I couldn't read the Arabic language newspapers yet. But so I order and I start reading them. And immediately I come across these conversations that were like, the Prophet Muhammad was the first Arab feminist. And I'm like, what? Like, really, like, these conversations like really jumped out at me, and I had no way to make sense of them with the existing scholarship on Algeria. And so just kind of trying to contextualize those conversations and understand what they were about ended up being this entire book project. I never made it to Dakar and the kind of comparative element that I wanted to do initially, because it was just such a big story to tell. But yeah, so in some ways it feels like it found me, a kind of divine, path was ordained. And it's also really funny because my own experience as a Muslim woman, growing up in post 9/11 in America, in many ways, I never planned to write about women from the Middle East because it just felt too close to home, and like I had lived through too much bullshit to like get into this myself in the academic space. And so I think that's originally why I kind of gravitated towards the master's project that was about Black women. It felt like, similar, but at a distance. And then, this project found me, and it was kind of clear, like I needed to do this.
Yeah, right on. All right. That's often the best way when,
Yeah.
as they say, the project finds you. That's what's up. Um, so you well, you can describe the extent to which you do this, but you talk about, as you write at one point in the conclusion, the three domains of labor, education, and dress. And I'm wondering if you could summarize for us what you mean by that. That these three domains, labor, education, and dress, in other words, were contested sites of debates about modernity and social change elsewhere too. But how do those three categories, how do they play a role in what you're describing in your book?
Yeah. So I talked about the labor. Uh, uh, I talked about the labor piece a little bit with the kind of conversation about domestic workers. That's basically what that chapter is about: labor, how labor dynamics were shifting with the entry of all of these women into the workforce. And then in terms of education, what happens in this period is you get a lot of Algerians who are reading news from the rest of the Middle East. So they're reading about what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Egypt, all of these women's rights movements that are happening elsewhere in the region. And they're feeling really inspired by what they're reading about. Basically, in the case of Turkey and Iran and Afghanistan in this period, it's kind of these top-down projects from the leader, the king, in the case of Afghanistan and Iran, and Ataturk, or in the case of Turkey. But it's a kind of like government imposed idea of women's modernization. In other spaces like Palestine, Egypt, Syria, there's Lebanon, there's women's movements that are more grassroots that are coming up. But in any event, they're reading about this in Algeria, and they're really inspired. And they're kind of asking, like, why is it that these women in other places are doing so well, basically? And in Algeria, women are still really not playing any kind of big role in public life and in society. And so they kind of conclude that the biggest issue is education, and the fact that Algerian women are not educated. And at this time, the French colonial schools for girls that were open to Algerian girls were very, very few and far between. I think it's something like 69% of settler girls were enrolled in school-age children, and it was like 3% of Algerian Muslim girls. And so initially there's a lot of petitioning for the French, like, please open up more schools for girls. But even the schools that the French did open were more kind of artisanal training, like carpet weaving, not really offering a really good education. And so another dynamic that's happening at this time is that there's this new Muslim reform movement, which starts in Egypt at the turn of the century, but in my period, kind of makes its way into Algeria. And a crucial tenet of that movement is that women need to be educated. And so members of the Muslim community start fundraising and using those funds to open their own schools for girls. And those schools are offering a variety of subjects. And some of I talk about at the end of the chapter of education, one of the women who was in post-independence Algeria, she was one of the first kind of women members of parliament and ministers, Zuhur Wanisi. She got her start in one of these Muslim reformist kind of community funded schools in the period that I'm describing. The women who were educated ended up playing these big social roles. And that was something the community kind of had to do for themselves, because the French state wasn't doing it. The other thing that's really interesting about the education piece that I'll mention before I move on is that for so long, the history of Algeria has been told through this lens that really privileges the colonial relationship over all else. So it's like Algeria with respect to France, and that's what we're interested in, and we kind of have tunnel vision on that. But my work is part of a kind of new generation that I feel like, there's other people who are doing this too now, where we're thinking about Algeria's connections to the Middle East. Because as soon as I started reading these Arabic language newspapers, it became clear to me, like, oh, they're reading about what's happening in the Middle East, and ideologically, this is really, really important for them. Also, because it gives them this ability to write back against, like I mentioned, the French colonial perception of women and Islam. Like, they're saying, look, French women can't even vote, and yet women in Turkey get the right to vote in the 1930s. So they're saying, how are you going to tell us that we're backwards with respect to women's rights as Muslims when you have a Muslim country who gave women the right to vote before France did? So it provides this really rich rhetorical fodder, basically, that they take advantage of to level these arguments against the French. So that's the other reason that I think these conversations about education are really, really interesting and rich sites to see a lot of these dynamics play out. And then the conversations about dress and clothing is a chapter I have where I compare the conversations that are happening in the press around women and veiling to the conversations that are happening around men's hats. Because basically in this time, In Turkey, Ataturk passes a law where he outlaws the kind of old styles of hats. So the kind of fez or tarbush kind of red hat, that is outlawed. And the kind of turban style that religious men would wear, that's outlawed. And he says everyone has to wear this European style top hat. So that becomes, law in Turkey, and Algerians start reacting to it in Algeria. And so it provokes all of these conversations about identity. And they say any Algerian who wears a European style hat is in denial about who he is and thinks that he can advance himself by imitating the oppressor, and he is wrong and he is bringing shame on his people. It provokes all of these conversations. And I argue that, scholars, we tend to think of veiling as this like very particular thing, like, oh, this is this thing Muslim women do. It's really crazy. It's really weird. But what I say is like, look, when you look at it alongside discussions about men's comportment choices, you see it kind of follows similar patterns. Like certain styles of comportment illustrate what it means to be modern. Certain styles are about kind of cultural identity. Certain styles are about like a religious identity. And it functions in similar ways to other articles of clothing that are kind of politicized. So let's stop, insisting on the veil's particularity and start seeing it alongside these other things, which in Algeria is really illustrated by these conversations around men's hats.
There's a politics to everything. It's
Yes.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So as we start to sort of turn towards a close a little bit here, I did want to another sort of set of topic areas I did want to kind of return to that I at least alluded to a little bit in my initial question is how you deal with the at times at odds concepts around religion, Islam, and nationalism.
Mm,
And because again, in that study group experience that I just was coming out of, that was a theme throughout the continent. Uh, and so I'm just curious. Well, I'd like to hear what you say, or how your book deals with all of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in some ways, one of the things that drew me to this period is that multiple futures were understood as possible. I think it's this moment of kind of opening where some people are looking to nationalism as the answer to their kind of prayers. Some people are looking to Islam and a kind of religious, re-education in religion. Some people are looking to kind of other spaces in the Muslim world and are envisioning maybe like a more pan-Arab identity. There's all of these different, some people think that they should stick with the French and, assimilate basically. And so there's all these different kind of futures that seem possible, and they're not neat lines either. There's overlap between them. Like that's something that is so interesting to me, is how there are these moments in history where a lot seems possible and then there's a kind of narrowing. And I argue that, by the late 1940s and 1950s, when anti-colonial nationalism becomes more dominant as a kind of ideology in these intellectual circles, there's a kind of closing of what's possible that becomes the dominant path imagined forward. Uh, to the extent that some of the figures that I write about, are later assassinated because they don't necessarily believe in a, independent Algeria, and it's understood as if there's like no space for them in this thing that's being built. So that is to say that there's not like one distinct answer. But I think definitely there is the piece that interests me, both in the book and in general, in my, including in my teaching and things like that, are these kinds of revolutionary understandings of Islam as a revolutionary project. And you definitely see that come up in this book.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in again, but that was something, because again, admittedly, that a lot of my and I'm assuming I'm not alone, but my own ignorance around the subject is that my approach admittedly, to any engagement in Algerian history has largely been through the decolonial efforts
Mhm.
and Fanon,
Mhm.
more specifically. Um, Yet another outsider
Yeah.
engaged in the Algerian, history and struggle. But one of the things that came up this summer, as we were, as I think I mentioned in my email to you, we were paying tribute to his and others' 100th birthday, was that there was a gentle criticism of him that, if I'm remembering correctly, that it would how it went that that he, in his criticism of religion, of Islam, missed the point that you just mentioned, that he didn't appreciate enough the extent to which Islam was generative in terms of a revolutionary anti-colonial, and missed that aspect of it. And I
Mhm.
thought that was just fascinating, as someone, again, who struggles with religion, and then any criticism of Fanon. I'm like, I thought that was very interesting.
You're like, "I'm out. I'm
I'm
out."
out. I'm out. I'm out. But I thought that, but then you bring it up and just mentioned it again, and I thought that that's reminded me that I meant to bring that into to raise with you here. But yeah. So anyway, sorry for that. Just wanted to.
No, 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 no. I no, totally. I get it. And it's, I have a little bit, the same dynamics basically. Fangirl of Fanon in certain ways, and in other ways understand. I mean, I think what's frustrating as a historian is when he's understood to be a reliable historical narrator, and I'm like, that's not his role. Like, we can appreciate the theory and also understand, like, he dropped into Algerian society at a particular moment. Of course he's going to get certain dynamics wrong. Of course he can't speak on them as as somebody who would if they were fully integrated and understood and studied the history and all these things. Of course he's not, so it's completely understandable, I think, and doesn't detract from the value. It's just a question of knowing which hats he can kind of wear and which ones he can't, and that's okay.
It's just levels. There's always levels to this. That's
Yeah,
all.
yeah,
And so. And of
yeah,
cour and what a lot of us, and myself included, appreciate, I mean, that it was just, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, I don't want anybody to be upset with me for saying it this way, but it was sophisticated and dynamic, cheerleading for revolution. That was
mhm.
his primary. It wasn't, "Let me distill all the nuanced
Yes,
specifics of Algerian reality, et cetera, and so
right,
forth."
right.
But, I admit I appreciate that. This just let's just, let's go. But no, but yeah, so absolutely. Um Now, you did mention this, and this was sort of, and by no means, feel free to whatever you would have wanted to raise that I haven't invited you to, please bring it in. But you did mention something, in your use of the word possibility, that is literally in my sort of, concluding question for you, that you
Mhm.
raise in your conclusion. That So I said here that your book ends with a line about the possibilities of the interwar period. How would you assess the state of those possibilities today?
Yeah. Um, I mean, we had that kind of conversation at the beginning about Algeria today, and I feel like that's kind of where I would put
Okay.
what I think about it today, which is that, honestly, I mean, I really hesitate to opine on it, because it's like I study a very particular moment, and there's just so many dynamics at play between the period I study and the present day that I'm not a scholar of. And so, but I think that there's a lot of there is that I will just say that tradition of women's activism is something that is very I get the sense, again, as an outsider, but it is very alive for Algerians in their kind of sense of their national identity and things like that. And I would argue that there's a long lineage of that. Like, basically, a few years ago, there were the Hirak protests in Algeria, where people were protesting, the kind of lack of democracy democracy, or the constrained one single party democracy. And some of the new reporting on those uh, uh, protests in coming out of the Western world was like surprised that you would see women, playing this very central role in the protests. And I like, anybody from who's familiar with the history would not be surprised, because there is that long lineage, there's that lineage, and not only the lineage, but the enormous energy that's expelled remembering that lineage as well. That is so alive for Algerians today that it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think the one thing I'll say is that, in terms of the kind of like public discourse around Algeria, I think sometimes the thing we have to be wary of is that there is a kind of flattening that can also happen in the valorization of people. So, like, Algeria takes on this kind of mythical status almost after 1962 around the world for what they were able to achieve. And I think that um, it can just kind of flatten the complexity of what actually went on, and the variety of women's experiences. And now in recent years, there's more scholarship that's doing these oral histories with women and talking about the different roles they played in the revolution. But those histories matter. I'm thinking about the recent book Maghreb Noir, that's talking about blackness in North Africa, and she is in this kind of post-colonial period, this era of decolonization, and she digs into the Black Panthers in Algiers. And I was thinking about how interesting it is that, like, we see these social media posts all the time that are like these images of the Black Panthers in Algiers, and it's really exciting, it's really inspiring, it's really, it's fodder for our minds to think through these kinds of global solidarities, which are all good things. But we're also like very uninformed still about those histories. Like, what was it actually like for them there? Were they facing racism from Algerians? Were they coming in with their own kind of biases about Arab people or Muslim people? Like, what were these dynamics actually like? And so I'm so grateful to this new generation of scholars who are kind of giving us more information about that, so we're not stuck in these kinds of one-dimensional representations of people, even if that one-dimensional representation is coming from a kind of revolutionary spirit. That we're not still flattening basically people's complexity.
No, absolutely, right on. I did, by the way, if I can, I do want to ask you something about what you say here in the conclusion that I'm not. I just don't think. I think I was just admittedly reading too quickly and didn't quite catch the meaning here. But I'm drawn to the quote. Um, in summarizing your work, you say here, attention to this period with a turn away from the teleology of the War of Independence reveals a whole host of actors and discussions that the focus on nationalism has rendered insignificant. In 1962, writer Khatib Yassine stated, "quote To write in French is almost on a much more elevated level to snatch a gun from the hands of a paratrooper." End quote. Um, what's being said there is because you're talking about the issue of learning and writing, and you talk also about the importance, as you describe it, if I caught it correctly, of people in Algeria learning French and to rebel in French, and that this was an important step in decolonizing from the French, which I in some ways seems to be a contradiction. So could you, yeah, help me? I'm sorry. Just could you
Yeah.
just help me with what's happening there?
Yeah. So what I'm talking about is how the teleology piece, I'll kind of try and break this down piece by piece. The teleology piece is about how The Algerian War of Independence was, and Algerian independence, the success of it in 1962 was such a kind of like world shattering moment. Both in terms of like the lived reality of people in the 20th century, but also, for us as scholars, that we have trouble looking away from it, basically, to the extent that even I feel work that is doing Algerian history in the period before still has this kind of obsessive look towards 62, and is always kind of trying to trace its lineages, like, oh, this is the beginnings of this is proto-nationalism, for example. This is the movement that later became nationalism, that later led to 1962, for example. It's still animating the kinds of questions that we're interested in as scholars. And so I think part of what my work was doing is saying, like, what if we decenter those dynamics, not just the dynamic of eventual independence, but even the colonial relationship itself? And we just say, we're interested in this society, and what kinds of things are they talking about? And how can we understand what that is without needing to make some kind of argument about who matters as historical actors? Like, for example, people who are assimilationists, if we're only thinking about 62, then we see those people as the enemy. Those were the enemies of progress. They don't merit our scholarly attention. And what my inquiry was animated by was saying, what if we assert that all of these people matter, even the misogynists and the feminists? We want to hear from all of them, the anti-colonial people and the assimilationists. What if we bring all of them into one frame of discussion? What kind of dynamics can we see about Algerian society that might, bring kind of new conclusions? And for me, that was the discussions about women that I felt like animated all of those people for different reasons, and to different ends. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in this period. And then, how the quote from Khatib Yassine is about writing in French is taking, the gun from the paratrooper. It's a way of saying that later in the 60s, in this kind of decolonial moment, there is a very clear understanding that writing in French is performing this really, complex work, basically, is doing this really complex work. And we don't typically talk about the earlier period that way. But why I bring that up is to say, well, that's just as true in 1930. For someone in 1930 to be writing in French and saying the French state claims that it cares about Algerian women, but it's not opening schools for girls, it's not doing anything to actually improve women's status, that is its own form of snatching the gun from the paratrooper and speaking directly, to the oppressor about what they're doing in their own language, so you're sure they understand. There is a kind of work of real value basically taking place there, even if it's not the thing we would traditionally expect or be looking for.
Okay, yeah, I admit, because sort of the tradition I've been politically raised in, it would look more critically at adopting the colonizer's language, and would
Yeah.
be encouraging a move away from that. So that was why that framing of it,
Hmm.
which I generally like, the
Yeah.
relationship of language or something uh ideological to something material, like snatching a gun from a paratrooper,
Hmm.
is I like that framing, but I admit it comes from the opposite political perspective
Yeah.
from what I'm
It's
used to. So I
really
was, yeah, struck by that. Yeah.
It's really complicated in the case of North Africa, because
Mhm.
they decide post-independence that they want Arabic to become the national language, which makes sense. But there's a kind of North African dialect of Arabic that is spoken, and there's modern standard Arabic, which is shared across the Middle East. And modern standard Arabic is almost like learning a second language, for Algerians, because it's so different from their own dialect. And so it produces this whole problem where they don't have people to teach in the colleges, and so you have, people from Iraq, from other places in the Arab world, moving to Algeria to become teachers. And I remember somebody who was Moroccan once telling me, like, you have no idea how lucky you are in the American context, where the language you speak at home, the language you think in, and the language you write in are all the same language, because we don't have that. Like, our brain is literally fragmented. And especially for the older generation who grew up still when French was more dominant, it's very confusing,
Mm,
And so that was even more true during the colonial period. And so it's really it's complicated. And so I totally appreciate what you're saying about wanting to move away from the language of the colonizer and things like that. But I think in practice it's really quite complicated, especially when you have these questions around dialect and different versions of a language, and
right. Yeah.
it's very layered.
Yeah. Sara Rahnama, this has been great. Thank you very much. Just one more check in to make sure if there's anything about your work that you wanted to make sure to highlight that I didn't invite you to. Please, I don't want to cut that off, but I have greatly appreciated beginning to dive more into your work, and look forward to more. And thank you for joining me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this was such a pleasure. Thank you. This was fun.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.